joined together in Presque Isle for a family dinner, which was wonderful, and now we're here together again this weekend. So it's with a special heartfelt feeling this morning that we're standing in front of Paul's tombstone to conduct this special ceremony.
Let me begin by reading a few verses out of Psalm 90, which I thought that I had easily marked because I could put my finger right on it. But Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or even you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. You carry them away like a flood. They are like asleep. In the morning they are like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. As you kind of look around, and there are the generation of Blackstones that I knew are buried here. There's some more down there, and we're probably related to a lot of people in the cemetery that are buried here. The original Blackstone, the original Perham Blackstone acreage was this block that you see over here. Is that right, Gary?
Yep.
We weren't on this side of the road. And we actually have a photo. Is it at your house, Mom? The photo where this land was largely uncleared. It was always amazing to me to see the sign on our barn that says Blackstone Homestead, founded in 1861. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is either I didn't pay attention when I was growing up, or our family didn't tell a lot of stories. And I'm sure it was that I always paid attention, and that, I always wondered about the 1861. I still don't know. That's one of the things that you never know about dates and names. You see them on paper. At first I thought it was amazing that my family would all land up here in 1861. At some point in my life, I began to wonder whether they weren't trying to avoid fighting in the Civil War, but I'm sure that wouldn't have been the case. But I remember wandering around this cemetery, and down there with the original family plot is the namesake that my dad and I were named after, a child, Clayton, that was born and lived only 2 months. Three of the children only lived about 2 months. I never thought much about that when I was wandering around the cemetery as a kid, until our daughter had a stillborn. And suddenly what a family would have gone through at the loss of a child became real to me. If you want to connect all the family lineage, Carla can do that, and she can tell which branches are connected to which. But the thing that's memorable to us, at least to me, are the stories. The stories that make the person live. Unfortunately, again, either I didn't pay attention, or we didn't tell a lot of stories in those days. I can tell you a story about Bowden, who would have been my Dad's great-grandfather. There is a fiery side. I'm sure that it skipped all the other Blackstone lineage, but there is a fiery side that went through the Hartson Blackstone lineage that was here. It is a demon that continues to haunt me, and it's a good thing that my wife and son aren't here. They could give you a very current story about the fiery side of me that showed up when I thought I was going to be late for my mother's birthday yesterday. I don't know, this is a rabbit trail, but in my family, my definition of being on time is being anywhere from 15 minutes to a half hour early. My wife's definition of being on time is being there within 2 or 3 minutes of when something starts. And my kid's definition of being on time is getting there before it ends. And so it pretty well has served as some source of frustration over the years. But Bowden had a temper. It's the only family story that I remember coming through of Bowden. But Bowden was a musician, and they were having a recording session with the old wire reel recorders. And apparently Reed and Carol, my grandfather and Paul's father were horsing around. And right in the middle of the recording, Bowden shouts, "Thunderation! Will you boys be quiet?" And of course it made the recording. And but that's the only Bowden story I know. I know one Fayette story. My dad's grandfather. When Fayette married Georgie, his second wife, my grandfather, Paul's father, again, this is really hard to imagine because I never knew my grandfather and Uncle Carol have any sense of humor at all, hardly. I mean, they were always serious. They jacked the wedding was down here at the farmhouse. They went into the barn where Fayette had his car, and they jacked it up, put it on blocks just enough so that the wheels didn't touch the ground. And Fayette and Georgie went out to leave that night after the wedding and couldn't leave. And it was dark enough so they couldn't tell why the car wouldn't go anywhere. What we discovered, and all of these stories really have a purpose for what I want to kind of share with you. Because it's the stories that we remember, for the most of us. What I didn't know is that there was more to the story. I actually found it out yesterday at my mom's birthday party. I was telling this story to Barry, and Barry said, there's more. Go over and ask Dad about that. Uncle Wendell, Barry's dad, was 10 years old when Fayette married Georgie, and Wendell went with them on their honeymoon.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Who knew? Did you know that, Dale? No. I found that out yesterday. You didn't know that?
No.
So I said to Uncle Wendell, so why did you get to go? And he said, I don't know, probably because I was their favorite. Who knew? But to be honest with you, that's the only Fayette story that I remember, or that maybe that was ever told. Now I could tell you lots of stories about my grandfather and Uncle Carol. Some of them are probably better that I not tell you. My grandfather really wasn't. If the temper gene went through my grandfather's side, I only have 2 stories that I remember about him, and they all have. I mean, he had good reason to be angry. The boys' dad and Uncle Don were horsing around. And again, it's hard to imagine my dad and Uncle Don horsing around because they were always pretty serious. But they were horsing around while the boys were, while the men were thrashing wheat. And if you've ever been around a thrashing machine, it's a pretty dangerous thing. And my granddad got mad at the boys, and it is a beating my dad always remembered.
Oh.
Because the only thing that in those days the Board of Education applied to the seat of learning. The only thing that my granddad had at that particular point were horse reins. But you know what? What do I remember about my times with my dad? They were those times when he told me stories. The most memorable experience with my dad took place on our other farm as we stopped while we were building fence, and he told me stories. You know, it's one thing to go around the cemetery and look at the names and see how we're all interconnected. But what do we remember? We remember the story. And I guess the thing that I would most like to have us think about as we continue the conversation about what does it mean to be family is to tell each other the stories, because we're going to forget probably that Bowden was Hartson's son, and then Bowden gave birth to some children, Fayette and Mary gave birth to Reed and Carol and Hartson. And so on. But at some point, we'll go to a cemetery that's got a relative, and we'll look at the name, and we'll think of a story. And we can't undo the fact that our ancestors were so serious and so intent that maybe they didn't tell the stories, or maybe we didn't listen. And maybe our kids won't. Who knows? Probably what will happen is they'll remember part of the story, like Fayette and Georgie. But I'd be willing to bet, and this is my experience as a pastor, my congregation cannot remember from one Sunday to the next, most of the time, what I preached on. But if I start telling a story that I told 17 years ago, they can finish it for me. And they might not remember every detail perfect, but they can pretty well finish the story. And we can't tell all of our stories. When I sit down with a family about a funeral, I sit down a lot of times with strangers. I say to them, tell me stories. If you tell me, well, they had a temper, doesn't mean anything. Tell me that they yelled thunderation in the middle of a tape recording or a wire recording session. That's something you remember. And you can take these stories and kind of piece them all together and learn something about the person. So tell stories. Tell stories about your family, tell stories about the people that you know that are part of your lineage. And Gary was actually here on the farm when Paul came back and lived for a number of years, and he's going to share just a little bit about Paul, and then he's going to sing.
My earliest remembering of Paul were when I was just a young boy. This mysterious man that would come home from New Jersey once or twice a year, driving a BMW, wearing the, I don't know what you call them, fedora, beanie hats, whatever you call them, but always being completely enthralled by this man who was an engineer and would lug home soap samples to all the aunts and uncles. He was a relatively quiet man, I always thought, but whenever he would come home, he would always, at some point, come over to Mom and Dad's house and say, "Do you suppose one of the boys could give me a hand?" And I was often, I don't know about my brothers, but
You were his favorite.
On many occasions, I would go with Paul, and we would do some kind of a job over at his mom's house. And that's what I remembered about Paul, just this mysterious man who said very little, but knew so much, and but always was very attentive to his mom and dad when he was home. In the latter years of Aunt Glenna's life, Paul came home. You see on his tombstone, engineer, inventor, caregiver. Paul was one of the most benevolent, generous men I've ever met, and he did it in such a quiet way. He didn't look for accolades or acknowledgement. Many things that happened on the farm, he did in a way that was, I want to do this, but just don't tell anybody. And his benevolence today is still occurring through trusts and other methods that he set up when he was alive. And I had the privilege of living next to him for the last 9 or so years of his life. And probably after we had just made the decision to stop farming, and I was still putting up hay, and one day he came to me and he said, "I'd like to help you do anything I can do." So Paul became my rake man. He and Wendell were instrumental in every year in the ability to put in the hay. And he was always very attentive. He wanted his rows straight. He wanted to understand how the equipment would run. We had many discussions over the equipment, as a matter of fact. For a guy who had left the farm so many years ago, he seemed to know a lot more than I did about the farm, or so he thought, or how things should be done or fixed. And I can remember on many occasions say, "Paul, you just got to trust me," which was really kind of awkward since I was talking to an engineer inventor. But Paul would always surprise me in some real special ways. He became my parts runner. If I needed something, if I was working on a piece of equipment, he'd say, "I'll run and get that for you." And he would come back with a part, and oftentimes a bag of food from McDonald's or Burger King. He never asked me what I wanted. He just showed up with the food. Paul was a simple man of faith, but a really complex man. He played the piano with those arthritic, gnarly hands that if you ever shook his hand, you knew you were shaking a hand, because his hand would just envelop your arm. And he'd squeeze hard. A couple of times over the last couple of years before he died, I would stop by the house, which I did often, and we would engage in conversation. And he'd say, "Do you know this song?" And he would open up the hymn book, and he would sit down at the piano, and he'd start playing. And I'd say, "No, I don't know that one." He said, "Well, sing along with me," and we'd sing. Paul touched many lives, and he continues to touch lives. He was faithful to his heritage, as many of my other aunts and uncles had been. And this time of year, when the hay begins to be cut, I think of Paul, my rake man, who would go to the corners and gather up the little bunches that would squeak out and put them in the row because he wanted to make sure we got every stalk of hay off the field. And we worked together. Our heritage is a special thing. And as we remember today, as we share in remembrance of Paul and others who've gone on before us, we, at least here in the Blackstone group here in Perham, understand that our faith has been a very important part of our heritage, and something that I know Paul would want mentioned today. That it's because of a relationship with Jesus Christ that one day we can spend eternity together. And I look forward to that grand reunion someday. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, when the saved on earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. On that bright and cloudless morning, when the dead in Christ shall rise, and the glory of his resurrection share, when his chosen ones shall gather to their home beyond the skies, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Let us labor for the Master from the dawn till setting sun. Let us talk of all his wondrous love and care. Then when all of life is over and our work on earth is done, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.
Amen.
We've lost a couple of Blackstone men in the last few months, and one of those was Fred, who was very much a part of the reunion tours, and I know that we all that shared those moments with him do have memories and do have stories that will be told for many years. And I would like to share Fred's obituary. Fred J. Blackstone Jr. passed away on March 24th, 2015 in the University of Vermont Medical Center in Burlington. He was born in 1919 in Caribou, Maine.
the son of Fred and Eva Whittier Blackstone of Caribou. Fred was a curious man, which led him to many adventures on untraveled paths around the world. At the age of 19, he went around the world on a Norwegian tramp steamer as a helmsman. He jumped ship in Montreal. Can't imagine Blackstone doing that. Just as World War II started. Fred was a gunner and a radio man on combat aircraft, and then commissioned a first lieutenant to command an Army Air Corps squadron, then serving in the Philippines as communication officer in the 5th Air Force. After the service, Fred was a bush pilot in Alaska and Canada. He most enjoyed flying airplanes and seaplanes and was a flight instructor. He became an engineer for Boeing, did property appraisals, and played a key role installing the Atlas ICBMs at Air Force bases during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He felt his major life's accomplishment was patenting a force-limiting device that enabled live human volunteers to survive uninjured in head-on auto crashes over 50 miles per hour. Beside flying his planes up and down both coasts with his family and on business, in his later years he enjoyed many long solo flights. Fred was exceedingly grateful for his wonderful wife of 55 years, Madeline Sutter Blackstone, who predeceased him in 1998. He positively adored his lovely companion, Lenny Gerard, in the twilight years of its life. It was an adventure of both mind and heart. Surviving our two daughters, Dorothy and Sandra. I don't think any of us will ever forget Fred, and one of my best memories about Fred is his getting up at my house in southern Maine and reciting poetry to me at 6 o'clock in the morning. I know others have wonderful memories of Fred as well, and certainly those that will go down in our storehouse of memories. He was a special, special man, and I come to appreciate poetry more and more as I remember things about Fred, and especially having coffee with him at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and him reciting any piece of poetry that I would ask him to do. We also lost Roger Blackstone just very recently.
Lord, as we kind of stand in this place with a host of memories, some of them just names, some of them bits and pieces, and we only know part of the story. And we wonder what it was like to come to this place uninhabited and clearing the land and beginning to farm. We wonder what mums and dads felt as young children of 2 months died. We wonder about people that we never can imagine playing in these woods, aggravating their parents. And we remember. And so on this day, we are grateful both for the country that allows for freedom and exploration, and we are grateful for the lives of those that have gone before us that have made our lives compared to theirs easy. We are grateful for all of that, and for Paul and Carla, who have been so instrumental in helping to connect some of those pieces and reminding us of the heritage that is ours. Amen. And the last thing that we ought to do before we leave is to sing Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Carla. Happy birthday